Sci-Fi. My name is Matt.
And my name is James.
And this week on the show, we are keeping it pretty light. And for episode 2, we're going to be looking at some comic modernity in our Dystopia series.
Yes, comic modernity. So this is going to be an interesting one because it's a little bit less sci-fi-esque, wouldn't you say, Matt?
Yeah, well, we're easing into the heavier, more serious subjects that we're going to be getting into later in the series.
Yeah, and I mean, in our last episode, we looked at things to come, and there was lots of like technological advancements and things like that. And I think we're following the same trend with today's two films, aren't we?
Yeah, the advancement of technology is what drives the comedy and the plot and the themes of these two films, isn't it? But we haven't introduced them, James. What other two films we're looking at?
So today's two films are Modern Times from 1936, starring Charlie Chaplin, and Playtime from 1967 by Tati. Is that how you pronounce his name? How do you pronounce the full director's name?
Jacques Tati. It's not his real name, but that's like his stage name, yeah.
Jacques Tati.
Yeah.
Yes. It's good. Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about these ones because, yeah, I've definitely got some things to say about them. They were interesting watches. But shall we get into it?
Yeah, let's start off with Modern Times then.
Chaplin the Great returns in Modern Times, a truly great film.
Back. Section 5, more speed.
Charlie Chaplin. Who else but Charlie Chaplin can make us howl with laughter or move us to tears? When he's being shoved around, or even getting tough, or acting like a hero, he is, above all, profoundly human.
Okay, it's a 1936 one. You know how we usually get when we're watching the really, really early ones. They can be a bit hit or miss. We talked about that when we talked about things to come and how much we were impressed with how well that one was put together. How do you think Modern Times holds up? Because Modern Times was the same year, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, it's a Charlie Chaplin movie. It's one of Charlie Chaplin's most famous, most beloved movies and most iconic, I think it's fair to say, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely up there, isn't it? And I mean, there's so many great sort of set pieces in this. He does some crazy choreography, as you expect from Charlie Chaplin, as I'm sure we'll get into as the podcast goes on. But yeah, it's definitely up there. But it's one of these ones which I'd never seen it, and I hadn't heard like loads about it. But then again, it's probably my peers not really talking about Charlie Chaplin films that often. But yeah, I was very impressed with it.
Did you at least did you ever feel like you'd seen some of it while you were watching it?
Yeah, there were certain scenes like the feeding machine. I think I've seen that in places, and I think just also like the tramp character in general. I've seen Charlie Chaplin do that. It's his iconic character, isn't it? It's the same sort of one in all of the films he does.
Yeah, it's the tramp. It's very much what he's known for. Certainly for the sort of majority of the first part of his career. So I don't think I'd seen this before, but I had definitely seen several sequences of it out of place. And, you know, I was watching it, I was like, I've seen like this whole like half hour of it. I don't know where I've sat down. I don't know if I just sat down and like watched a long YouTube video, you know, of like some of the scenes. But certainly like the first scene where he's in the factory, I'd seen all of that, the entire sequence.
Oh, wow.
To when he leaves the factory. That was all totally familiar. I think I might have studied it at uni, possibly in one of the classes we didn't do together.
Ah, interesting. So you went in feeling like you knew this film like quite well then?
Yeah, totally, but like all out of sequence. So similarly, I'd seen him in the department store later. I'd seen all of that as well. But that it doesn't quite make sense. I didn't realise that it was the same character necessarily in the same film, and that he was going to go from one to the other later on.
Yeah, because it is so much about the set pieces in this, and it goes on sort of like quite a trajectory, doesn't it? Because it's got lots of scenes which take place in certain locations, and that's sort of where the comedy comes about. But I think before we sort of dive into the film itself and start to sort of like analyse those scenes, we should talk a little bit about the zeitgeist of the time, because it was the Great Depression, wasn't it? That was happening sort of like throughout the 30s, and that was the big thing on everyone in America's minds. And this is like an American-made film, isn't it?
Yeah, we're in the thick of it with the Great Depression in 1936. Extremely bad times economically. The other side of the Atlantic, you've got everything going on in Germany that we talked about, leading to the rise of Nazism and all that. That's in full swing in 1936, as we discussed, and that had similar economic, factors pressing on that situation as well. And we're seeing Chaplin take a look at that and then roll around and fall on his bum in it, right?
Yeah, lots of falling over, as you'd expect from Charlie Chaplin. But also, this film was considered quite communist as well, wasn't it? And I mean, Charlie Chaplin was accused of being a communist, and he got into quite a lot of he got into some deep water over that kind of stuff, didn't he?
Sure, this is pre-McCarthyism, witch hunts and all of that in Hollywood, but I'm sure the kind of the tone of, if you're not passionately capitalist in America in the first half of the last century, then you're a communist. And to be fair, he does the character does he gets mistaken for a communist and I don't even think he's necessarily doing anything that was overtly communist. He just goes in with like a trade union on strike, but he gets mistaken for being like a communist agitating leader type guy, doesn't he?
Yeah, he's at the top. He's at the front of a march at one point, and then gets taken away by the police for sort of apparently leading this march. But again, it's just like comedic circumstances, isn't it? A lot of this is sort of like a fish out of water kind of scenario.
It is, but I suppose like from a filmmaking point of view, it's the decision to put all of that on screen, isn't it? Like The Tramp is very, very innocent and bumbling and foolish, but it's Chaplin's decision to show a strike and protesting over like working conditions and all of that and food shortages and everything. Putting all of that on screen that is a big decision. Like, and it's pointing out that there's problems in the economy in America in 1936.
Yeah, and he is really making a comment on that, because like the character of the Tramp himself is someone who's a bit of a down and out, because he is the Tramp. He is the guy who is like, he's on his last legs for a lot of the film. He's trying to sort of get by, but at the same time he's kind of like, he's trying to work the society that he's in a way that will benefit him as well in a lot of points, but very willing to like do his bit. He's not work shy. Well, he can be a little bit, but like he's actively seeking work throughout a lot of the film, isn't he? There's a point where he gets sent to jail, and he actually prefers that because he doesn't have to do any work. But when he's not in jail, he is actively seeking work, and he's trying to like create this American dream. He's this kind of like he seems to want to pull himself up by the bootstraps in that kind of American dream kind of way at times, but yeah, when the opportunity presents itself to not do that, he also kind of would be happy to do that as well, it seems. Yeah, it's sort of, it's all that kind of stuff, isn't it? It's sort of like the way he's just sort of getting through in life. But so what is life like for the Tramp then? Sort of what is his situation? We start off and we see him in this factory, right? And he is one of the workers, and you quickly get a sense that this factory is using its workers in a way just to get the most out of their products. They're on the factory lines, they're in the assembly lines, and it's moving at such a pace that he can't keep up with it. He has a nervous breakdown from working in this factory, which is mad, and he can't even go for a piss without his boss turning up on a massive TV screen in the toilets.
I love that. That was a really like surprisingly futuristic. I wasn't really expecting anything like that. It's like Big Brother, isn't it? Like having the boss on the screen in the bathroom. I really enjoyed that when he's just trying to have a smoke. To be fair, he was trying to have a smoke, not go to the toilet. But, I'm not.
Yeah, he's trying to sort of like have a little bit of it. But it was his break, and
it was his break, and he's a broken man by this job, isn't it?
Yeah, and so it's dystopian from that kind of aspect, isn't it? Because I think it's got a lot of similarities to Metropolis, and I know Charlie Chaplin had watched Metropolis prior to making this, and I think he'd taken some of the some of the ideas in it. Like obviously you've got the factory and the workers and these grandiose machines everywhere. And for me, those are all sort of like science fiction aspects, right? Because it's futuristic looking technology. This is not the technology necessarily they would have had in 1936. Certainly not like massive TV screens and things like that. And it sort of gives it that sort of futuristic look as well, doesn't it? But it's still very much the 30s.
Yeah, I was put in mind of Metropolis as well, and I was trying to be mindful that we don't reference Metropolis too much. It's already episode 2, and we've done it in both episodes. But definitely, like that factory at the start looks like it looks like Metropolis, where the workers have to. They look like they're just turning their hands on a clock all day, don't they? Whatever it is they do with those big arrows in Metropolis. But it was very reminiscent of that. And yeah, you're right. It's a sci-fi feel to it in that first scene, which, yeah, it was a little bit unexpected.
Yeah, because also, like, you don't really think of this kind of film in the 30s, like a comedy film. And this would have been quite mainstream because it's Charlie Chaplin. And he is, like, the most iconic, biggest star of the time. And for him to be doing something on that, and he's making a comment on society, isn't it? Because the whole film is about how he's seeing the society that he's in, or a future society, and it's that classic science fiction thing of it could just be 10 seconds in the future, like with Black Mirror. This is like a look at the near future where these factories have gone to the extreme, and you've got a worker who can't keep up with the pressure, but because he's making light of it, it's easier to watch, and it doesn't go down that dark route that I think a lot of the dystopian science fiction films we're going to look at throughout the series are going to go down that darker route. But I mean, it's still got that kind of edge to it, hasn't it?
Yeah, definitely, and that's still quite a strong political message, and in some ways it's an even stronger political message because you make a light-hearted comedy film with your lovable tramp character. He is, like you said, he's like the biggest star in Hollywood. It's going to be an incredibly mainstream film, and then to basically, I mean, the message of the film is there's very little work available, even if you want to work. A lot of the time, you're better off in jail because if you can get work, working conditions are, incredibly inhumane in this striving for like ever more productivity and efficiency, at the cost of your humanity, basically. That's the kind of political message that he's getting over by just being Charlie Chaplin and, waddling about and doing his quirky little movements.
Do you think he's anti-technology then? Is that kind of the thing you got from this?
No, not so much. I think like with the kind of political historical context, I think it is more about, it's not anti-technology, it's as many cautionary sci-fi tales are, it's not anti-technology, it's anti the misuse of technology in a way that kind of damages one's humanity. That's Black Mirror's premise, isn't it? It's not against technology, it's how the technology is being used. And I think that's why he's chosen to put the factory scene at the start, as opposed to the food shortages, the people going on strike, any of that in terms of the sequencing. He's really going in on that kind of message of the use of the technology kind of in the wrong hands of these capitalist overlords, basically.
Yeah, exactly that. And I read in the on the internet about Charlie Chaplin had a conversation with Gandhi about this.
Wow.
Yeah, so when he was talking to Gandhi about he was having some sort of conversation about machines and like how they could potentially take over and stuff like that. That sounds very science fiction in itself. I'm sure it wasn't veering that way in exactly the way that we're sort of implying. But anyway, he was talking to Gandhi and he said, I grant the machinery with only the consideration of profit has thrown men out of work and created a great deal of misery, but to use it as a service to humanity should be a help and benefit to mankind. But as they were discussing it, Chaplin apparently came to realise it was the first part of his statement, machinery that only considers profit, has created a great deal of misery, and that's what mattered the most. So
that was his takeaway.
Yeah, that was his takeaway. And that's, I think, is really fueling this film.
Yeah, definitely.
Because It's not the machinery. It's not this future technology which is supposed to be making things quicker. It's the fact that they're using it in such a way that it's making people's lives a misery. Like the tramp is having a terrible time on the assembly line, and even when I think one of the most interesting bits is when they get the feeding machine.
Definitely.
So the feeding machine it's implied that it's there so that they can keep working. They don't have to take a lunch break. This machine will come over, feed them, do everything you need to, and then they can get straight back to work.
Yeah.
And I mean, that is dire.
Or I think
it?
even like stay on the assembly line and continue working while the food is like shoveled into your mouth.
Oh, jeez. I mean, that scene is hilarious as well, though. Like, it's the bit when he's getting the soup. He gets the soup put to his face, and then it starts malfunctioning, and it just ends up all over him. And I'm like, oh no, just keep going. Let's do it again and again.
Yeah.
And it's just it's the comedy in that, but at the same time, it's got this dark undertone that what if this kind of technology was getting used? Like, what would that mean for the workers?
Yeah, absolutely. Like the point is very clear that he's making, and that's the whole film, really, isn't it? That it's he's got a very clear point about the dangers of these things and this world that he sees himself living in. But the point of the tramp is that he can kind of place him into these scenarios and allow comedy to happen, even though the message might be quite serious. It makes me want to watch other films with the tramp and see if that's the same in all of his tramp films. I actually don't know a great deal about Chaplin. I haven't really seen, I think I've only seen one or two.
Well, I mean, we're sci-fi guys.
Yeah,
it's not, it doesn't usually come up, does it?
Well, I love comedy, but I'm not that well educated on like your silent cinema comedy and your early talkies. Yeah, so I kind of want to see if that kind of like political landscape around the tramp exists in other incarnations of him.
Speaking of talkies as well, there's like a slight bit of dialogue, isn't there, in this? Like,
it's confusing.
Yeah, I think I read that this was supposed to be his first full sound picture. But as he was doing it, he realised the tramp character's not someone he should talk.
Sure, that's fair.
So they kind of like stripped that back and they went back to doing it silent.
People talk on recording and over like the broadcast equipment and stuff like that. So there's a lot of voices in the film, but no spoken dialogue. Is that right?
Yeah. The only dialogue that the tramp actually has is sung, but it's like a song that doesn't make any sense. It's just like all random lines, isn't it?
Is it not French?
Yeah, it's French, but
right.
it does to me, from what I could gather, not that I know much French.
I don't speak any French.
But I think it was sort of like made up stuff.
Oh, fair enough. Right, okay. Yeah, that suits him, yeah. Because he forgot all the words, didn't he?
Yeah. And I mean, that adds to his character, doesn't it? All that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's interesting that it had to be a silent film in the end for it to sort of like work with his character.
Yeah. Yeah, then it just, I guess the addition of dialogue, like thinking about like the history of cinema, the addition of the dialogue was just more of a gimmick almost, like keeping up with the trends of cinema. You want some talky element to it so that it still feels like it has that impressiveness, I guess.
La spinach o la bouchon, cigarette portobello, si rocchi spaccaletto, ci
So we talked about how he's kind of oppressed by this world and he's robbed of all his humanity by his job at first and then his inability to find a job and his imprisonment and all that. How is the tramp asserting his humanity against that? How is he pushing back on that?
Well, I mean, the factory scene, which we keep going back to as such like a central scene, he is sort of like revolting up against his work as a factory worker, isn't he? He's having a nervous breakdown, but at the same time, he's kind of like he is asserting his humanity in this moment, isn't he? Because he's spraying people with oil and he's running amok. He's sort of like he's making sure that he's not just doing that machine movement. He suddenly comes alive, doesn't he? He's running around. He's sort of like getting other people to take his place in certain positions in the line. And he's just sort of like, I think it continues throughout the film. You see him become more himself. He's sort of like, his funny walk, the way he carries himself, the way he interacts with people. He is very human, isn't he? He becomes more than just sort of like the factory worker, doesn't he?
Yeah, and prior to that, he's kind of he's got like a twitch, hasn't he? Because he's on the assembly line, whatever it is. He's basically tightening some nuts, and he can't like stop doing that jerky nut tightening movement when he's away from the line. So he's shedding that kind of twitchy weirdness to become the tramp again.
Because that's robotic, isn't it? It's like a machine, sort of like it's like he's acting like a machine because he's been doing it for so long. But yeah, the impact that has on him as a human being, not a machine, he's got that twitch all of a sudden. And it's stuff like that which I think is really powerful in this, because even though they're making a joke out of it, it's still like, for anybody who works like a job like that where it's repetition, you're doing the same thing again and again, you can become machine-like. And this is it's just pointing that out, isn't it?
Yeah, and then he basically turns into Daffy Duck and destroys the place and gets carted off to hospital.
That does it. You can take your new broom and sweep your own floor. I read that.
I thought there was another good example of the kind of asserting his own humanity onto the need to have a job later on in the film. Kind of in the second half of the film, we see him more proactively looking for work, and he's quite willing to work and find a job, like I said before. But what's kind of half and half is when he gets the job as a night watchman. So he wants to like provide for this girl that he's met, this girl who's out on the streets, the gamin. I don't get that.
It means street urchin, basically.
Oh, does it? Fair enough.
I had to look it up because I was just thinking of gammon.
Yeah.
So
I thought it was some weird nickname or something. But they kind of fall in love, and he wants to like provide for her. So he gets this job as a night watchman. And at that point I was thinking like, oh, he does buy into this whole American dream capitalist thing, and he wants to work. But he uses that job as an opportunity to, you know, let her in, spoil her with food and treats, let her sleep in the nice like bed department, and then, you know, play around with the roller skates. That great scene where he's almost roller skating off the edge.
Yeah,
and,
so good.
Yeah.
I can't believe he managed to do that. Like, obviously he wasn't doing it in real life. It's like there's not really a ledge, but just the choreography of that, like skating backwards like he was doing. The choreography is amazing. His like physical ability is, you know, as a dancer basically, but also the technological, the matting. I can't remember how it's done. I have looked it up before, and because again, when I was watching that scene, I was like, I've definitely seen this because I know how this shot's done. I think I did it at uni. But yeah, it's all very cleverly done. And to come back to like his kind of Chaplin's attitude towards technology, stuff like that, that's quite an advanced filming technique. He's a vaudeville, silent film, now talky movie star. This is not a man who dislikes technology. He clearly loves technology. His career is based around technology. He directs these films. So he's got a view of how technology should be used in the right hands, and he's pro-technology for sure. But yeah, he's asserting that kind of humanity, that he wants to just create a nice life for him and the gamin and not really do a good job of being a night watchman. And then he can't like defeat the burglars who come in, and he ends up helping them. Yeah. So he's resisting that working world and actually just using it as an opportunity to live the life he wants to live. Yeah, because when you were talking about that as well a minute ago, when he was having the daydream, that really stuck in my head, when he's imagining this life with the gamin, and it's like, it's a utopian ideal that he's got in his head, isn't it? Like this capitalist idea that if you get enough money, you'll get a house and you'll live like Harry and Sally down the road. You'll have that sort of like dream house, and you'll be able to provide. And that's constantly what they're sort of chasing after, this ideal of this utopia that is just around the corner if you can get to that point work-wise. But they're constantly having to struggle against their position in the society, aren't they? Because they can't get jobs after the factory closes down. It's really dire for them, but they're still sort of like, they're still trying to get by however they can. And I mean, I thought it was really interesting that the tramp wanted to go back to prison so badly.
Yeah.
Because that, for him, that was like the perfect life. He got all his food. He had like a little cell to himself. He was just like living like a life that he wanted. And he's even sort of like going against the way society works at that point, trying to get back to prison. He's sort of taking stuff and giving it to people. He's not paying anything. And I just found that really interesting because he's kind of like, it's kind of his way of causing an uprising, but he wants to still be in sort of like the system. He wants to get back into the system to be in prison.
Yeah. And the things that he does to break the rules to get back into prison are, like you said, he steals nice food and stuff like that. He's not doing anything unpleasant or unseemly or violent or whatever that would get him sent back to jail. He's just, having nice things or taking the blame for other people as well is the other thing. That's like what he does for the gamin. It's interesting what you said about them having this fantasy, that they want to have. And you said it's like Harry and Sally down the street or whatever. But what I thought was interesting was that, I mean, this is 1936. It looked very Dick Van Dyke Show, Bewitched, the sitcoms that are going to come 20, 30 years later in America when the economy is booming. So you've got the Great Depression, you've got the war, and then the American economy just goes gangbusters post-war, and that's why they're the America of today. But then you see the culture change and you get that kind of utopian lifestyle on TV, but it's not played for laughs in the same way, or it's not seen as this unattainable thing. It's seen as aspirational. It's like you can live like Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore and all of that. It's going to shift into that, and that will become the norm on screen.
Yeah, and it's like that comes from this idea here, doesn't it? But it's not showing the reality, is it? Like, this is showing the reality of the 30s and the sort of like what it took to get to that point.
Yeah, but it was the reality of the 30s. It might not necessarily be as much of a reality. I mean, there will be homeless, destitute people in the 50s and 60s in America, but those numbers will reduce with the growth of the middle class in America. Everyone's doing a lot better economically, and it becomes a more normalized thing on screen. But Charlie Chaplin's living in an age where that seems a million miles away. It's literally a fantasy to have that kind of economic security.
And I mean, he is trying to get that economic security though, isn't he? Because he's trying all these different jobs and things like that. But I found it very interesting, the fact that the job that he managed to do the best at was the most human one, where he's singing and he's having to interact with people. And I thought that was like quite a nice sort of juxtaposition between the assembly line at the start, where he is constantly just having to be a robot, and then in this other scene, he's having to show his humanity by singing and like waiting on people, which he's not very good at. But it's when he starts singing and dancing and being himself, people love it, don't they?
Yeah, and the same with the gamin as well. She's got him the job there because she's a good dancer, and she's actually doing really well for herself. She's all like, she picks him up from jail, and she's well dressed, and she's got a job. She can get him a job. Everything's like turned out rosy for her because she's a singer. It makes the ending like really sad that the police, like, that she's still, her crime is vagrancy, which like doesn't, what is vagrancy? What is the crime of vagrancy? It's like not having a home, basically. I don't know, but it doesn't sound bad. And she's clearly not a vagrant anymore. She's made something of herself. She's a good dancer and she's doing well, and they still ruin all of that, and they have to go on the run at the end. It's such a bleak ending, isn't it? Yeah,
really bleak. But I mean, it does have moments of sort of like almost happiness at it throughout the film. I mean, when they find the little shack on the beach and are sort of living that life for a bit, they're both just so happy to have a house.
Yeah.
Like, even though it's the most run down shack you've ever seen, and the tramp has to sleep outside in a little shed with straw, it's like all of these, but they're sort of making do, aren't they? And they're so happy just to sort of have somewhere. And it does look like your idea of a dystopian sort of like favela or something like that.
Yeah, it's not a million miles away from the piles of caravans in Ready Player One, is it? That kind of living space. It's pretty grotty, but yeah, it's very endearing that they're happy there, and they just want to like make that home, and that's what makes them so endearing. That's what makes the ending I guess, not totally bleak is that, like, that the gamin appears to be quite similar to the tramp. They're going to land on their feet after doing a hilarious pratfall, like, so it's supposed to not be that bleak. I think it's more like watching this and Playtime a little bit, that we'll talk about later, but watching these, thinking about dystopias and thinking of them as dystopian films feels like quite a bleak lens to watch them through.
Yeah, but I mean, it definitely is a dystopian society, isn't it, that they're depicting? I mean, it's just that further ahead than what it was in 1936 that it becomes a thing of science fiction, just we've talked about with the technology and stuff, but it's so sort of like close to the mark for people watching it around the 30s. So I think all of that really adds to it as a film and a product of the time and the zeitgeist. But there's also this idea that, like, the tramp is kind of not in the time which would suit him the best. Like, he seems a bit sort of like a man out of time as well.
When would you place him?
I can't quite think of where, but whatever it is, he's a bit of sort of like, it feels like he doesn't fit into this society. And I don't know what society he would fit into, but I think that's something which will come up again when we look at further dystopian films. Like, there's something that makes you different from your peers. And that's really sort of marked out with the tramp, isn't it? Because he is the one human and unapologetically human character. He has a nervous breakdown. He sort of like is doing things for other people. He's doing all of this stuff that is supposedly against the norm for a lot of people, and he gets punished for it. He ends up in prison. He loses his job. It's I think all of that kind of element to it, I think, makes him more of an interesting character as well.
Yeah, I get what you mean. Like a dystopian society requires the majority of the population to go along with it and normalize everything, so that the baseline of a normal dystopia is established by how people behave. So then you get your main characters who just don't fit in. Then that does make them appear out of time, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's ironic that this is called Modern Times, yet he doesn't seem like he fits in. And I think that's the same as the sort of like one of the main characters in Playtime, which we'll talk about. Like, it's this idea of also being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He's constantly in like scenarios where he shouldn't really be there. Like, he ends up at the front of that march, and then he ends up saving the day in the prison when there's sort of like the people trying to escape jail. And there's lots of sort of happenstance stuff that happens to him. And I think that's sort of like it's where all the comedy lands as well, isn't it?
Yeah. You said he helped the prison situation. I mean, he's a grass, James.
He's a snitch.
Yeah. That. Whose side are you on in that prison situation, James? These are some down and out guys struggling out in the real world who are locked up unfairly, I think. Or some of them seem pretty nasty.
Yeah. I think you could take it either way, can't you, with those guys?
But he is also able to sometimes leverage the kind of right place at the right time as well. Like the night watchman job is an example of that. He literally just... Are they just walking past and someone's broken their leg? The night watchman's broken his leg. And the gamin's like, hey, go on in, get a job. So he's got a bit of both. Sometimes it's wrong place, wrong time by the labour strike, and sometimes it's right place, right time.
I think that sort of like changes throughout the film as well, doesn't it? Because he's suddenly taking notice of what's going on around him, so he can be in those situations. I mean, like you said, that moment is more to do with the gamin sort of like being like, oh, you go in, get a job.
Yeah.
Like, this is something you could do now. But I feel like it does sort of like go down that way towards the end until the climax when the guys from the police come and sort of say, we've got to take you in, and then they have to run off.
Yeah, they can't escape this society, basically. And that's a very dystopian element that, like we were saying before, like they do... everything works out for them. They finally find jobs that suit them both, but they cannot escape this punishingly cruel society that they live in that won't let them, adjust to it, even though they could kind of become part of that normalized culture. One of these drones that just gets along with the dystopia. They could do that. They're on the way to doing that. They want to buy a house and live the American dream, but they're just not allowed to do that. They're punished for their previous actions. They're punished for not fitting in and being different.
And in that last scene as well, it's very stripped back, isn't it? There's no sort of buildings, there's no machines anywhere. It's just sort of like almost the countryside, but it's a bit more sort of like the desert. I felt when I was watching it, it felt like just outside of Vegas or something.
Yes, yeah,
like that
like
kind of
thrown
image.
out of Vegas.
Yeah. So it's like they're on the highway, and the tramp says, "Smile, like smile, and we'll be all right." And again, it's sort of like he's using his humanity again, isn't he? He's sort of like trying to look on the bright side of this terrible, terrible situation they're in. And then maybe just down the road, there'll be a place for them which is a bit more like, just like a nice, almost utopia somewhere, maybe.
Maybe, yeah.
Or maybe they'll be back at the factory doing exactly the same thing again.
Yeah, they'll be rounded up and sent to the poorhouse.
Oh, God. Let's hope that's not how it ended afterwards for these characters.
Yeah, so I guess everything's going to be all right for those two characters. He's a bit of a fish out of water, and Chaplin seems to have created a female counterpart to the tramp that matches him in that way. Shall we move on to our other fish out of water story then, with Jacques Tati's Playtime?
Yes, let's talk about that.
A 1, a 2, a 1, 2, 3, 4.
So you're a big fan of this film, aren't you, Matt? Because you recommended this when we first looked at the dystopia list. You were like, let's get Playtime in there. It's the perfect opportunity.
Yeah, I always associate... this always comes to my mind when thinking of dystopias because of the setting of the film. Without jumping too far ahead, the setting of the film, the design, the production design, and how everything looks, and also the way the characters interact with the production design. Yeah, I'm a big fan of this film. I love it, but I'm really interested to hear your thoughts because you hadn't seen or heard of this before, had you?
No, I'd never heard of it before, and I've got to say this felt like the perfect counterpart for Modern Times as well, because again, you've got that comedic aspect, but you're also looking at society, like a society that is so concentrating on looking forward and to the future and modernization, and just like how hilarious that can be at the same time when things don't go to plan. And this sort of like goes along all those sort of routes, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's got good gags, but same thing as watching Modern Times, like that bleakness of looking at it really like through the dystopian lens really comes through, and it's not bleak and miserable, but it's just so like sad in a nostalgic way. I felt this film. It's like the characters aren't being like crushed by the dystopia, but you get a really clear idea of what they're missing out on. Something has been lost in this transition to modernity in Playtime, and you feel its loss in the film, despite the humour and despite the silliness.
Yeah, I think that's such an important thing to look at when you sort of talk about this film as well. Like just that sort of like there's so much trapped in the mundane and the little things that they're going through throughout their lives, and just trying to navigate this world, which is, because it's a hyper consumerist society, isn't it? I think that's how they describe this. And it's a view of a futuristic Paris, but it's a Paris which is quite far removed from the traditional Paris you always think about. Like whenever you think, they make a big point about this throughout the film, there's a woman who's constantly trying to get a photograph of what Paris looked like traditional Paris, and she can't get one in this sort of future version because everywhere is big, massive buildings and sort of futuristic-ish tech, which doesn't quite work. And all of that stuff's there. And the only thing that is like ye olde Paris, like any sort of like bit with history to it, is a woman who's selling flowers on the corner of a street. But is she even selling real flowers?
I'm not too sure about that because all the flowers look pretty horrible in the film. Like there's borders around the apartments that we see later that look very plasticky. I don't actually think there's any real flowers in the film, but she might be selling real flowers. If anyone would be selling real flowers in this film, it would be that flower woman, because she is she seems lost. She seems like an old woman who used to sell flowers in the Paris that was, and now she's living in this miserable grey future where she's still trying to sell flowers. So maybe real flowers.
And there's so many shots in this as well where you get glimpses of sort of like the Paris landmarks. Like,
well, yeah. Barbara's trying to get her photos, but there's like 3 moments where. So you're talking about this incredible grey futuristic landscape that's just plain office blocks, basically. But there's 3 moments where you do see exactly what she would want to photograph reflected in one of the many glass doorways as they open. You see the Eiffel Towers behind them, the basilicas behind them, the L'Arc de Triomphe is behind them. I think Barbara clocks it. I think she's the first one to do it, and it's the Eiffel Tower. And she looked like she was looking at it, but she doesn't get her camera out. She just carries on. So I'm not sure if she sees it or if it's just a joke for us.
Yeah, but it's because like the fact that they're not looking at these landmarks, and isn't the film as well sort of like a bit of a comment on like what it would be like as a tourist to go around Paris in the future?
Yeah, basically. I mean, that's the plot of the film, right? So we should go over the plot quickly.
Yeah, because it's a bit thin in terms of plot.
Yeah,
but lots happens.
Yeah, lots happens, but plot is not at all important to the film. But it is basically just sort of a series of vignettes loosely following a group of American tourists who are visiting Paris, and it's actually. It is quite clear that it's Paris from the start, isn't it? Because is it Orly Airport, which I think isn't possibly now Charles de Gaulle Airport, like the main airport. I'm not sure, but it's Paris Airport that they're arriving in at the start of the film, and then we just move from airport to like an office furniture expo.
Yep.
To some futuristic apartments, where one of the characters visits an old friend, to a restaurant, which takes up the most of the film, this scene in the restaurant. And then how does it end? Is there another... Oh, and then the kind of...
The carousel.
The carousel, yeah. The carousel of modern Paris.
Yeah. Which is basically just a revolving roundabout, but it's such a spectacle in the film.
Yeah.
But you talk about the vignettes as well. Again, that's another thing which made me think of Modern Times when I was watching this, because I watched this almost straight after. And Modern Times has got like the factory, and then he's got like the shipyard job which he goes to, and then there's the prison, and then the night watchman bit, and it's a series of sort of vignettes. It's little set pieces that happen, whereas like this again is using that sort of model, and it's like it's showing you things about the world. It's the world building, and this is so good for the world building because so much happens in every shot, but you're not really focusing on one character, really. There's like a kind of a protagonist.
Who do you think, when you say that, who do you think is the protagonist?
I think of the older gentleman who's there for the sort of like the business meeting. But I think I might just think that because I've seen the film poster and it's got a picture of him sort of hand drawn.
Well, that's Jacques Tati, wrote it, directed it, starred in it.
Oh, that was him. Amazing.
Yeah. So in my memory of it, I associated it with him being the main character, and that character, Monsieur Hulot, he's Jacques Tati's like signature character. He did about 4 or 5 films with Monsieur Hulot as the main character, and really was the main character. But this is quite late in his career, and he's trying to retire the character and be a bit more mature in his filmmaking, I think, is where his head was at. So what I noticed watching it this time is that Hulot is not in the film nearly as much as I thought he was. I was coming off the back of Modern Times, and my memory of Playtime was much more like, well, this is going to be very similar, but instead of the tramp, it's going to be Hulot, and he's just going to be stumbling through all those scenes that I remember. But he just vanishes for like huge segments, and I thought that Barbara, the tourist, was like right up there with him as a main character. We're following a group of tourists, but she is like the focal point of that. And sometimes Jacques Tati shows up and like slips over, but you know, it's kind of half and half, I felt, with those two.
Yeah, and I think it's got such a wealth of quirky characters as well that you don't focus on those other ones so much. You're not really focusing on Tati and Barbara for too long. Obviously, they feel like kind of central characters, but I was more interested in just all of the people interacting with each other throughout this world that he's created, because even the like, he uses audio and dialogue in a really interesting way. Like, the dialogue is mixed between different languages, isn't it?
Yeah, it's mixed between different languages, and it's all ADR.
Yeah, so it's all dubbed over, isn't it? And so all of that, and then they do lots of clever things like there's the one comedic moment where there's a businessman going down the corridor and his steps sound closer than they are to Tati as he's listening, and things like that. And it's all this sort of like this topsy-turvy world that's being created where you're hearing lots of different things throughout it, and it makes it a bit more chaotic.
Yeah.
And you're constantly trying to make sense of it. And it seems absurd just seeing these people wander around and get into these weird scenarios. And like even the restaurant at the end, you watch it kind of being built, don't you?
Built
slash
and then
being
falling
destroyed
apart,
straight afterwards. But it's like, and then a lot of it is about sort of like faulty technology as well, isn't it? Like you were talking about the expo. The expo's full of all these wonderful inventions which are sort of going to lead the future, but a lot of them don't really work, or
they're just like naff,
Yeah.
like a broom with headlights so you can see under something when you're sweeping under it, which is just like an invention that solves a problem that doesn't exist. It's just stupid.
Yeah, but we've talked about expos before, because like when we were talking about AI previously and virtual reality, like some of these new technologies are at these expos, aren't they? You see the latest things, but it was quite ironic that something that's supposed to be so futuristic and modern and helping you out and sort of like leading the way to the future, a lot of it was just sort of like silly stuff as well, like a door which you can't hear from the other side. I mean, that's all right, but there's not much to it. And I can't think, what were the other ones that
there was a bin that was made to look like a Greek Greek or Roman
Greek pillar.
Which I don't know, I thought it was quite nice, actually. I thought it was quite cool. But it's stupid.
The Hoover as well, or the vacuum cleaner with the lights on. And it was like, why has it got lights on? He's like,
that's the brush. That's just like, and they're trying to like demonstrate it going under something.
And they're fascinated when it actually turns on. Ooh,
but
how convenient.
But they're tourists, aren't they? That's the thing, that it's ridiculous. It seems ridiculous that you'd have a tourist group going to like a trade expo, like on their holiday. But it's just not something you do. And you've got the Eiffel Tower reflected in a doorway. It's right behind you, but everyone's being ushered in to look at the crappy bins and brooms.
And so this was made in 1967. So that's quite a significant time from Modern Times. Things have moved forward. Like you were saying, in America, they sort of, like after the Great Depression and things moved forward, they were moving into that sort of idealized version of America. Things were on the up. They were booming. Business was booming. And France was sort of like in a similar position, sort of after World War II. They were sort of like, they were rebuilding the country like physically because of all of the damage, but they were also trying to get more of a sense of national identity. And their president at the time, Charles de Gaulle, was really trying to make sure that France was up there power status wise. So I think all of this is kind of like feeding into this idea that Tati's got with Playtime, because France is on the up. Everyone's sort of like they did stuff with like the economy, didn't they? Like they changed. It was basically sort of like the politics of grandeur or something. They were trying to make everything. They were trying to make France great again. Make France great again.
I think there is an element of that. Yeah, I don't know enough about the French history, but I know that like de Gaulle was a war hero. He was like a general in World War II. Like he was beloved, and then he kind of entered politics later on. And yeah, there wasn't. He's kind of a political strongman type guy. I think was the kind of attitude. So very outward facing, very. I would imagine quite nationalistic, but also like really boosting the economy.
Yeah.
A bit of a, I guess he's a bit like Churchill. I mean, Churchill was only a politician, not a military general, but Churchill had that like later political resurgence as well, and kind of came back because everyone loved him during the war. And then he was presiding over that kind of baby boomer era.
Yeah. And it's all feeding back into sort of this dystopian world, isn't it? Because as things are progressing, can like society keep up with it? And it feels like these characters are constantly trying to keep up with these worlds that they're put in. I mean, Tati's character E02, he's just wandering from one place to the other, and he gets completely lost in this world. And I feel like a lot of the characters are a bit lost in these places that they end up. It's trying to sort of navigate this new world, which is so weird and confusing.
Yeah, and there's also a weird streak of everyone recognises him. Everyone knows him in Paris. He's lots of people are talking to other people asking if they're Monsieur E02, and they've just mistaken. They've just seen a man in a trench coat, and it's not him. But also, there's a series of characters who know him from the army. And like, E02, remember me from the army? Come into my apartment, come into my shop, come into my restaurant. They're all different characters, weren't they? It wasn't the same guy cropping up. Yeah. There's this idea that he's got this past. He was in the army. He's got this whole backstory hinted at, but all of his compatriots have gotten on with life and fit into this new Paris and want to greet him and bring him into it, but he just can't. He's incapable of fitting in, and he remains this quirky outsider.
Yeah, and every time he's sort of interacting with his environment or other people, he seems like he wants to get away, doesn't he? To a degree. Like he can't find the person he's supposed to meet in the business meeting at the start. He tries to sit down, but it's making weird sounds.
Yeah.
And he ends up in the expo, and he's sort of like, he just goes along with the flow and then gets moaned at because someone thinks he's trying to steal their ideas because he gets mistaken for someone else. It's this whole sort of this journey he goes on throughout is just him trying to make sense of it all. But it's kind of like there's a lot of a dehumanization element in there as well, isn't there? Because everyone is so obsessed with the little patches of world they're in. Like when he goes to the amazing office scene with all of those cubicles is fantastic. And I mean, we should say that all of the sets were built by Tati and his team, and it took like ages to put together.
Yeah, it was 6 years to make, millions and millions of francs. It's called Tativille. I think some of it's still there outside of Paris. I think it was seen as a bit of a like, I don't know. I think people might have thought he was completely mad to be pursuing this project. And when you watch the film, knowing that there's a place called Tativille and so much of it was built, I don't know about you, but I found myself wondering like, but how much of it? Like, surely not that building there. Surely not those six building. But I think it's very hard to know. I think genuinely a lot of those buildings, presumably they're hollow or smaller than they appear. I don't know, but there's a lot.
Yeah,
there's a lot of buildings.
There's
constructed.
so much time and effort that's gone into it, and I think Tati was quoted as saying like, it's no different than getting one of the big celebrities to star in my film.
And fair point.
Yeah. I just haven't paid them. I've just made an amazing set, which is amazing.
Yeah, and it's quite funny that people still see that as a sort of a disaster financially, but he's clearly correct mathematically that I think it was Sophia Loren, and he quoted as like, I could have got Sophia Loren for the money I spent, and like it's quite hard to argue with that, isn't it? But I think it was still seen as a bit of a passion project gone mad.
And I mean, yeah, but he managed to persuade people and get it made, which is the main thing, because this is fantastic. But going back to the office scene again, sort of seeing the people in the cubicles and sort of seeing how they interact with each other is so interesting, because they're all sort of stuck in their own little worlds. They're not really paying attention to anybody else. And that's sort of like the definition of a dystopian society, isn't it? Like, you see that in so many things. I think we'll see it in 1984 when we look at that. There's so many images of people stuck in their little sort of worlds doing their thing and they can't get out of them. Like, but these people just seem quite happy to just go about their normal lives and not really interact, like especially with the cubicles. I mean, I think just seeing all of those, it's such a grandiose image, but there was something about that which sort of got me thinking about all of that.
Yeah, the cubicles are amazing, and Hulo gets lost in them like he's lost in a maze, doesn't he? Even though it's a fairly straightforward grid pattern, he gets completely lost. And there's this like a spider at the center of the web. There's a woman who's an operator, a phone operator, but she's like a robot, isn't she? She's oddly mechanical. She has her own little booth in the center. You can't see her from the waist down, and she kind of like rotates at 90-degree angles while she's talking very robotically in English on the phone. Or does she speak in English and French? Or is she mixing up?
I think she mixes it up.
Yeah, because she's getting calls from everywhere, and yeah, she's very quite creepy and strange. And he's like turning around the corner and she's facing him, and then he goes around another corner and she's still facing him, and it's really surreal and strange.
And there's like an image later on in a scene where there's a guy at a counter and he's like fixing all these people's problems, like it's tickets or something. And he's at his counter and Hulo sees him from the other side, and he sees these feet going back and forth. Yeah. And it's just like, just looking at that, and he's seeing it from the other side. Like he sees the woman in the cubicles from the top down. Yeah. And then now he's seeing like how crazy and frantic the bottom half is for someone in a similar sort of situation.
It's very cartoonish, that scene, isn't it? It's very like Looney Tunes, Warner Brothers. The movement of that he's a travel agent, isn't he?
Yeah.
Just taking all the calls, but remaining very straight-faced on the top half that Hulo can't see.
It's like on the surface, everything is very serious and working properly, but then below the surface, it's all just going crazy.
But Hulo naturally finds himself below the surface, or at least on the wrong side of the presentational side that everyone else, that the tourists are ushered through and shown.
Come here, let's see the sights. What the book says, that should be... Oh, come on, girls. Wait till you see how modern it is. And they even have American stuff. Come on.
So that's like an element of the dehumanization, isn't it? And you were talking before about the way sound is used. I thought that kind of added to it as well, just because it makes all of the dialogue seem unreal, or, you know, just false, basically, doesn't it? It's also, it's mixed in a very interesting way. So what ADR dialogue there is actually quite low in the mix, and it is more about those footsteps like you described, or a strange buzzing of a light and things like that. Or, you know, an entire scene takes place where Hulo's visiting his friend in the apartment and they're talking to each other, but because they're in the apartment you can't hear it. But if a couple walks past walking a dog, you'll hear like one line of dialogue from them just out of place. So it kind of removes any sense of personality of any of the characters in a bit of a way. Like, we talked about who's the main character, Hulo or Barbara. I think Tati said that this is a film about everyone, which is an interesting thing to say. I think it kind of feels like a film about no one rather than everyone. It's a film about the environment, not really the people. The people don't feel like real people. They feel like objects moving around a dystopian world.
Yeah, and I think he reflects that in the way he shoots it as well, because I think I read that he despises close-ups. He loves to do like long shots and mid shots. Everything is from a distance, and that gives a kind of like voyeuristic look almost, but also it gives you this sort of like bird's eye view of situations, because there's so much depth in the shots that he's got. You're watching every single person walk around, and you're looking at all the little details of their interactions with people. And I think that's what makes it really special, was sort of like looking at a society in general, you are looking at the society and the way people are interacting with each other. You're not looking at whoever the protagonist is and following their story as much. You're totally in the world that he's created.
Yeah, he was a mime as well, amongst other things. Jacques Tati.
Wow.
So some of that reluctance to go into close-ups and keeping the long takes, I think there's a link there to like miming and performance art like that. You know, this interest in the whole movement of the whole body and what that represents and how bodies interact with each other. That's what you're seeing in Playtime, and that they're not, like I said, they're not people, they're objects, and you need to see the whole body to do that. And there's times where they're even like, you know, the tourists and the people who work there are getting shunted around like cattle, aren't they? Where, you know, you don't want to see a close-up. The point is that it's like 7 men in a row getting on a bus and they're all dressed identical, holding briefcases, and they're all, you know, file on in a little crowd. That's what's important, and their faces don't matter at all.
But then all of that is kind of like, it's expanded upon in the last scene in the restaurant, isn't it? Because they suddenly become more human, don't they? Because you follow all of these people and you see all these different people in these different buildings and stuff, but it's not till that last scene that you start to get an idea of people's characters where they let loose a bit. And there's very specific characters that are doing stuff in that final scene. And obviously they're having fun and they're drinking and there's music. And it's not as focused on the sort of like the modern aspects of this world. If anything, it's talking about how the modern aspects are ridiculous because everything keeps going wrong. There's this breakdown of the societal barriers that have been put up by the technology in that final scene, because all the technology is going wrong, yet it's the people having fun and getting drunk, and then the building falls down, they create like a VIP area and stuff, and it's all that kind of stuff that is making them seem more human, and they're interacting with each other rather than their environment as much.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I was struggling to like figure out what was going on actually in that scene, and that's a really interesting take on it. Like, yeah, you're right. It's the breakdown of the things that Jacques Tati is not very fond of, the overuse of technology and the very sterile kind of modern landscapes. It's literally falling apart, and it allows the characters, and the fact they're getting steaming drunk, but it allows the characters
so drunk that one guy falls over, the bouncer turns the stool upside down,
and he's trapped
sticks
inside
him inside
Brilliant.
like he's in like a waste paper basket or something. It's brilliant.
Yeah. But with that technology breaking down, they become more human and they turn into individual characters. Like you said, there's loads going on. They're all like doing their own thing. Suddenly they become real people. Suddenly they are characters in a film, not mimes or cattle being shuffled around the city.
Yeah, and it's like slow, that sort of decline into it, isn't it? Like a good night out when you decline into raucous behaviour. But yeah, it's like the American suddenly stands out, doesn't he? The American businessman who's like really making lots of noise. And they've got the weird, like some of them have like a mark of the restaurant on their backs, and then he's sort of looking at them to see if they can get in to his little makeshift VIP area and stuff like that. All of this sort of like extra layer stuff.
It's really long, isn't it? It's not quite the second hour, but it's most of the second hour of the film. But there's like so much set up for payoff, isn't there? Like that. That's pointed out quite early. The little things that are going wrong in the restaurant include our chairs are leaving a weird backprint on people. You need to sort it out, and then it turns into something. There's like a payoff for that, even though that's a fairly decent visual joke that like we've got bad chairs, they leave a print, but then it's got a payoff later. There's like a malfunctioning light on a stair, so whenever we're near that step, someone trips over on it and drops a plate or something. I really, really liked the one waiter who has to stand outside, and whenever another waiter like tears a bit of clothing or stains a jacket, they go out and swap it with him until he looks like the tramp, doesn't he? He's just like completely dishevelled and all his clothes are falling apart.
It's mad, isn't it? Isn't he supposed to look like Napoleon by the end of it?
Is he? Oh,
or something like that. I think that might be the character. I read something like that, but I could be completely wrong.
One guy is the American says is like Napoleon because he's at the food service window. The door to it is half down and it makes a black crescent. So the American puts a circular sticker on it and he says he's the emperor of of cuisine or something like that. So he's supposed to look like Napoleon in the little hole.
I think that's it. I think I must have just misread that bit. But yeah, like lots of things like that happen out there, and lots of things sort of mirror other things in the world. Like you've got so many quirky bits, like the habits from the nuns that you see in the very first scene in the airport. Yeah, they flap like angel wings.
I missed this.
And then there's another bit with a priest, and he's standing by a neon sign.
Yeah.
And then the light goes out. It looks like he's got a halo.
Yes, yeah.
And they've got so many other bits, like at the very end as well. Like Barbara is finally clocking this kind of stuff, isn't she? She's got that the snow bells from Uso, and she goes, oh, they look like the street lamps. So she's seeing these sort of counterparts of things by the end, and I thought that was there's lots of interesting mirroring stuff that's going on in all of the scenes.
Yeah, it's interesting. Barbara never becomes jaded by any of that, because she is she's separated from the group by her desire to get this authentic photo of Paris. And then Hulot seems to appreciate that in her, and then, kind of befriends her later in the film. And he's trying to like buy her a nice gift, and yeah, he buys her that little flower sculpture, but she's always quite cheery and happy. And I don't know, it seems like she would become a jaded character. Do you know what I mean? That she's having the veil of this modern Paris lifted and realizing that it's not all that great, and it's a bit naff, and that she hasn't got to see the traditional Paris that she wanted to see.
Yeah, she still like had a nice time by the end of it.
It seems so, yeah.
But it's like she was really struggling. Like even when she went to the restaurant, it was like she thought she wasn't wearing the right attire, and she didn't feel comfortable and things like that. But then, as the night went on, she's playing the piano and she's really enjoying herself, and all of this stuff is sort of like, again, it's the humanity, and then it's becoming more human again by the end of it, and relating to other people. I mean, one of the other big sort of dehumanization moments for me was the moment like you were talking about with the flats, and they're all sat watching their TV screens, but they're facing each other, and they're sort of, you expect them to react to each other, but they're not in the same room. And it's almost like they do certain things, like one of them gets up and then someone goes, oh, and points at the screen, and you think they're interacting, but it's like, it's this disconnect with the technology, and all that kind of stuff is kind of like, again, feeding into dehumanization.
Yeah, and similar to what Chaplin does, it's a visual joke. It's there as a joke. It's there for fun, but it's making that point of the way this kind of prefabricated home society is dehumanizing people. They sort of look a bit like what's one of those like clockwork clocks, that would have like the little people come out of the
like a
doors
cuckoo clock.
Yeah, like a cuckoo clock, but when it's like little human figurines that come out, like a little wood chopper comes out and like chops some wood. They look very clockwork, robotic, and fake. Or I also thought it kind of looked like a CCTV display. There was 4 apartments, basically one room each, with a big window that we're looking through.
And because the windows are so big as well, there's no privacy. So again, it's this sort of like everybody knows everyone's business almost, because everyone has to be acting the same. So there's no...
I thought that as well. But then like towards the end of the scene, I clocked that they all did have curtains. They were just open by choice. Everyone's happy with this like being on display. And they are like display homes, even down to the fact that they've got those same squeaky chairs, haven't they, that we saw them in the office, then we saw them for sale at the expo, and now people have them in their homes, of course, because they're everywhere in Paris. It's just like they've basically just bought the trade expo, installed it into their homes, and then it's on display like a display home.
Yeah, it's all just sort of like the absurdity of it all, isn't it? Because everything is just following... Everyone's got the same sort of houses, they're living the same kind of lives, and there's sort of no variation. And the only variation comes when you sort of really get to know some of these characters and how they are interacting, and then sort of seeing them at that more human level.
That's absolutely true, but we don't get to hear, for example, that conversation. Like Hulot goes in and he's catching up with an old friend. That's a very like personal, intimate conversation, presumably possibly happening. But again, the sound is dropped for that, and actually all we hear is the footsteps and the completely irrelevant conversations of people passing by. So that moment of like human connection happens, away from us, removed from us by the sound mixing.
And like Hulo's trying to escape all the time, though, isn't he? He's trying to get away from that sort of encounter with this old friend, and yeah, he never quite finds the people that he wants to find, does he?
Do you have any sense of why Hulo is in Paris and who he's trying to meet and what he's trying to do?
No.
Yeah,
no.
he is trying to escape, isn't he? But
Yeah.
but I don't know why he's there in the first place.
I thought it was some sort of business meeting.
Yeah,
But then I wasn't sure, because when he first turned up, I was like, maybe it's a job interview, but it doesn't. He never finds the person. Well, he finds the person in the end that he was looking for, just because they're in a queue together.
Yeah, but I don't think it's very clear who he is or what he does.
No, he just goes, "Oh, great to have seen you."
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
And then he's off, and then.
But you're right, yeah, job interview or business meeting, because the first scene is the office scene, and he gets lost. He ends up going in a lift, accidentally, all that stuff. But yes, it's got a business meeting type setup.
Yeah.
But it's just not too important.
And
I
even
guess,
the way the porter uses the technology again, he's kind of like he's pulling all these levers and switches. It doesn't really do much, does it? He like says a few words to someone on the other end. It doesn't really get him anywhere.
Yeah. So overall, like, what do you think Tati is trying to say with this film? What is his take on the modern comedic dystopia?
Well, obviously he's looking at the way things are moving forward with technology, but I think in a sort of, it's almost like a kind of counterpoint to Things to Come as well, I kept thinking, because Things to Come is all about moving forward and then the progression of man, whereas with this film, everything is moving forward, but people can't keep up in that way. And it was the same in Modern Times, but with this in particular, Tati is saying you've got to still like look at things from a human perspective and look at how absurd some of this stuff is, because technology is always meant to be there to benefit mankind and help mankind sort of move forward and live better lives. But when that technology and these sort of like these buildings, these societies that you live in, when they become so sort of like dependent on these things, and there's no real reason for them, you lose something. And he's sort of pointing out all of these things, isn't he?
Yeah, and it's sort of broadly the same message as Modern Times, I guess, in that way, isn't it? But there's also this sense of like appreciate what you've got as well, because Modern Times is set in the present and Playtime is set in the future, and we've got this Paris, old, charming, lovely Paris just over your shoulder, just behind you. Don't get distracted by all of this advancing technology and modernity. And even I noticed as well, like that it's a worldwide epidemic of this horrible grey architecture. Did you see in the travel agent, they've got posters for like Hawaii and Japan, and it's just the same office block
with like a little thing at the bottom just to show that they're in a different country.
Exactly, yeah. So yeah, he's seeing that all over the world. It's actually, that's really interesting, because it's such a, at times it feels very French and it feels very about Paris in particular because of those flashes of the Eiffel Tower and L'Arc de Triomphe, but it's clearly something that he's observing internationally. It's perhaps not his focus in this film, but clearly in that scene in the travel agent, he's seeing it happening all over the world, I think.
Yeah, and I think both films are quite prophetic in what they're looking at, because you look at today's society and you look at technology is constantly moving forward. We're more obsessed with our smartphones than we are about what's going on around us a lot of the time. So like we are living in that technologically dependent society where everything is so dependent on sort of like what's going on social media, what's going on this app. This app will help me be more mindful. This one will do my accounts. This will do that. You're so sort of like, you get wrapped up in all this technology that sometimes you need to take a step back and look at how ridiculous it is, because like you look at how much you need technology now, like everything, like my entire life half the time is based around my smartphone, setting an alarm, doing my banking, just like writing a list to go to the shops, finding out where I am. Like, it's all of this stuff we're kind of living in that world.
Yeah, but this is coming to me from a man much like Chaplin himself, decrying all of these apps, but speaking to me in front of a microphone that he uses for his podcast that he loves, for his music that I know he loves. You know, you're just like Chaplin with his filmmaking and all of that. The technology can be in the right hands and used for the right purposes.
True. You've got to love it at the same time. Like, yeah, you think about all the things you can use it for, and sort of that side of things. But you do have to take a step back and look every once in a while and be like, this is a bit mad. This is a bit absurd.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Absurd. Who would have thought we'd be making a podcast in 2021?
Talking about Charlie Chaplin and Jacques Tati.
Crazy. Okay, so how would you sum up comedic modernity then, Matt?
It's it's just exposing the troubles of society, but then having a character kind of stumble through them in a funny way, so it doesn't sting too much when you're exposing those things.
That's a good way of looking at it, and I think with both of these films, we've looked at dystopias in a very interesting way to sort of like to get going in the series, because you're looking at how absurd some of these things are, and you can see outside looking in how they are flawed. And then I think as we go on, we're going to see like more flawed societies, but they might not be as fun.
Yeah, I hope you watched Modern Times and Playtime, and I hope you had a good laugh, and I hope you enjoyed them, listeners, because from now on it's getting serious. We're really getting into the more miserable stories from here on out.
Yes, next week we will be looking at the idea that we are the baddies. Are we the baddies, Matt? Are we the bad people in this scenario?
I'm not. Maybe you are.
Maybe I am. It's all my master plan. But yeah, next week we'll be burning books and taking pills as we look at Fahrenheit 451 from 1966 and Equilibrium from 2002.
Gun Carter.
Gun Carter. Yes, martial arts with guns and firemen burning books. It's going to be an interesting one next week.
That's going to be fun. So do join us for that. In the meantime, if you want to get more content from us, do head on over to our Patreon. That's a great way to support the show as well. You can find us at patreon.com/journeythroughsci-fi, where we have episodes on, James, what have we got?
We've got episodes on June. Our second spoiler half of June is on there. We've got episodes on Free Guy. We've got Black Mirror. We've got so much stuff on there. We've got a Nightmare video episode. Lots of fun stuff over on our Patreon. Or, of course, if you can't afford that or you just don't want to, you can leave us a lovely review on your podcast app of choice. 5 stars always goes down well. And when you're doing that, why don't you let us know what your favourite version of comedic modernity is? Is it in another film? Is it in a book? Tell us what it is.
Yeah, and make sure that comes with 5 stars.
5 stars, yes please.
But join us next time. We hope you've enjoyed that. And that's all we've got time for today.
Goodbye.